Okay, I believe we are now live on Facebook Live.
On the interwebs, Mary Mitchell, we are live on the interwebs and we're live in person. It is now almost fall. We made it through the summer.
It is Wellness Wednesday in September. We have made it to the
We,
fall,
we have made it to the next stage.
2020.
That's right.
We have a wonderful special guest. But I'm Mary Mitchell Campbell, and I am the founder of A Step, and this is Wellness Wednesday, where we bring well, I'll let you introduce it, Dr. Keith.
Well, you know what? You're a perfect guest because we bring the healing arts and the creative arts together. And sometimes we bring them together in one person to foster wellness for the entire community. So that's what you've done, Mary Mitchell. By the way, I'm Dr. Keith. I'm coming to you from Richmond, Virginia. And A Step brings us here, which is artists striving to end poverty. And Mary Mitchell, introduce our guest for today.
Okay, we have a very special guest. So this is Bobby Stegart, who has had many chapters of career. But I first met Bobby as a Broadway performer, and we did a musical together that is one of my favorite musicals, Big Fish. But he has now left the business and is a working and licensed therapist and helping many, many people in our community. So thank you, Bob, because you really do straddle everything here.
You're so welcome. I was honored you invited me, and I will also add that I've known Mary Mitchell since I was 19 years old. I was in a class in which you played the piano, so we've known each other for 20 years, if you can believe it.
It's a casual 20-year relationship.
Yeah,
a casual 20-year relationship. Wow.
I remember that class. You were quite excellent, and I think I remember your book. Like, I think I remember what you sang.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I mean, you have a very good memory.
Yeah, you sang Larger Than Life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what's coming back to me right now.
Mm-hmm.
Very talented.
Wow, 20 years ago. Or 19 years ago. Wow, yeah.
Don't ask me what happened last week because I can't remember anything. I can remember what Bobby sang 20 years ago.
These are new times. These are new times. It's better to forget last week. It really is.
Sometimes it is. So thank you so much for joining us. I think a lot of us in the industry right now are grappling with a lot of anxiety and depression. And I think a lot of people who have never done therapy before are really investigating the values of therapy. And I'm curious to hear kind of what you think for people who have maybe never tried it before, but are sort of considering dipping their toe into the therapy world.
Yeah, you have to be busier than ever.
Yeah, I am. I have a wait list, and I can't accommodate the amount of people who are looking. So I do my best to try to refer people to colleagues or to different resources. But it's ironically and paradoxically a really good time for the therapy business.
And yeah, I would imagine so. What do you think about people who are considering trying it for the first time during this time frame?
I mean, I think it's important to demystify it because, I think people can be very afraid to expose themselves in such an intimate setting, and I understand that. And I have myself, as a therapy client, have been afraid of that. But ultimately, for me, I think it's about verbalizing and externalizing your experience, which privately can be really scary, and it can fester in you. Your thoughts can be disorganized, hard to understand. And then when you go through the process of sharing these things with another human in this setting, your experience can go from being normal and shared and demystified and coherent and better to understand. So I always think about what you can experience privately as the monster under the bed. And the longer you avoid what you're experiencing, the larger and scarier that monster becomes. And so therapy is a way to just look at the monster, normalize that we all have monsters, and then just find tools to better deal with those monsters.
During times like this, when should people consider, okay, this is an extraordinary time and I'm having a normal reaction to this is an extraordinary time and I need help?
Well, I think we all need help. And I think, one thing is we're in this very individualist culture where we decide that we have to do things on our own and sort of thrive without our support networks and, be fine under really stressful circumstances. So I would argue that that we need help anytime, that we always are in need of support. The distinction between muddling through and really needing some support, I would look at how people are in relationship to sort of their daily experience. If you're having a hard time getting out of bed, if you're having a hard time communicating with loved ones, or with moving and having a physical practice like you're used to, or any distance from things that are usually a routine for you, that's when you might need some help in order to sort of get back on track and have some supporting and taking better care of yourself.
Right.
I'm a person who's kind of always been very pro therapy. And I've been in therapy for a long time, and I pretty much have never stopped. Like, my current therapist and I have been together over 10 years. So it's like one of the longest relationships in my life. And I feel like what is so valuable for me is because I feel like I am actually relatively self-aware, but there's so many things you can't see in yourself, that having an outside viewpoint is a game changer. And I fully believe that like everyone would benefit from therapy. Like, there's kind of almost no one who wouldn't benefit, but I am aware of the sort of stigmas that still sometimes come up. I'm curious if you run into people who, you mentioned demystifying, and I think that's a really great word, but people who still feel a certain sort of shame around going to therapy.
I mean, it's, for me, I'm noticing a major generational gap. You know, for example, people in my parents' generation, I think they were taught to believe that if you struggled with any sort of mental health issue, that you were weaker, or that there was something defective about you. And it's farther from the truth. We are humans. The human experience is filled with trauma and with anxiety and with depression. And it's just, I think, a baseline part of what it is to be alive. And so, you know, thankfully, I'm noticing that in the generation that I'm a part of, and then in younger generations, the idea of seeking out mental health resources is just a more normal one. So I would just argue to anyone who thinks of a mental health issue as a weakness, to try to reframe that as just absolutely central to what it is to be alive, especially in chaotic and crazy and really uncertain times.
I read an interview with you recently that brought up vulnerability, and you said that you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And the person who interviewed you asked you the question of, do you think people are looking for a vulnerable therapist, or would they rather have someone who seems confident and authoritative? I think your message about being vulnerable is important, because when you're strong in your vulnerability, you become confident and authoritative. Can you talk a little bit about the message of people embracing their vulnerabilities?
Sure. I mean, I think confidence must, if it's authentic, include a willingness to be wrong, a willingness to be seen, and a willingness to feel the complexities of your experience. I think any other kind of confidence is not really authentic. And so to be authoritative, to be assertive, for me, it must be balanced out by not knowing everything, by being a human. And so that's the only way, I think, to be able to understand the complexities, is to accept the complexities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, vulnerability, I think I'm a huge Brene Brown follower. I don't know if you follow any of her writings, but it really changed my whole views on vulnerability, and looking at the vulnerability as a strength, especially as like in leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
How much that really changes it. What kind of, I know there are different kinds of therapy that exist. Can you tell us a little bit about those and what the benefits are around any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think any therapist worth their salt probably integrates a lot of different ideas and is really following their very specific instinct with the person sitting across from them. But there are different schools of thought. There's, you know, Freudian psychoanalysis, which is really about someone's unconscious, exploring their dreams, exploring the things that they're not quite conscious of or aware of. And then there's also, especially because of insurance companies preference for short-term care, there's something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which has nothing to do with your past, nothing to do with maybe underlying traumas or issues, but really about thoughts and emotions that come up in the moment and how we can better understand them, respond to them, and then that can therefore lead to more effective relationships and behavior. And really, I'll use ideas from CBT and I'll use psychoanalytic notions, but ultimately I like to lead from a more humanist approach, which is the whole school of thought that really the client has all this strength and understanding within them to improve their lives. So I try to go from a very strengths-based belief in someone's capacity. That's sort of, that's where I always try to lead from, even if other philosophies come in.
I find that fascinating because in the work that I do with burnout, we're helping people recognize their strengths, and a lot of people don't understand the strengths that they have. And one of the things that leads to burnout is trauma. And we've talked a lot on these episodes that this is a very traumatic time. And a lot of times our value is tied to our identity. And you work with a lot of artists who are experiencing not only the trauma of the virus that's happening and the impact of being not being able to live their life, but they're actually losing what they value as their identity. And therefore they feel like they're not making a difference. Can you talk about the who am I, why am I here, and what is my purpose kind of existential angst that artists are going through right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's legitimate and it's real. And what's great about artists is that they ask those questions, right? Artists are brilliant because they think about identity and they think about themselves in terms of what they're contributing and what they're expressing and whether that expression means anything. Those are all enormous strengths of an artist. I will speak from personal experience that my identity as an actor was pretty absolute, meaning that I really kind of experienced myself through one pretty strong lens. I thought of myself as Bobby Stegert, the actor, and my value was tied up in that. And that's a big reason why I knew I had to shake up my life and find other channels through which to value myself. And a lot of channels that were private and mine, as opposed to channels that were very much connected to the outside world and how I was perceived. So if there is an opportunity for artists right now, and there are a lot of limitations, I'm not trying to minimize any of them, it's to explore versions of identity that are not dependent upon their work. And there are so many versions. I have clients who are using this time to explore what kind of son or daughter they are and how to be in better communication with their family members. I have people thinking about their identity when it comes to how they care for themselves and their body and their mental health. So I would just say that big picture identity can mean many, 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 many things. And your work as an artist, as important as it is only one lane of a much more multifaceted human being.
Right. That is so true and so hard at the same time, because I feel like similar to other avenues that are career choices, especially pursuing like Broadway, like you and I both did together, is so all consuming. And it's such an intense, it sort of almost takes over your entire life in a way that it's really hard to feel like you have identity outside of it. So it's a gift to have this time. It is also a really, I think it's a very anxiety producing time to look in the mirror and say, who am I without any of those identifiers?
Yeah, and that's terrifying. It's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to widen the definition of who you are without the work right at hand. And the great news is that if you really do the work and if you really investigate the complexities of who you are in terms of identity, it makes you a better artist. And at some point when opportunities do come back into the picture, then you're better off for it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I always talk about with A-Step and being an artist is that you are a better artist when you know who you are, We are on a lifelong journey to try to know who we are. And for me, the best way to sort of figure out who I was by volunteering and traveling, because it threw me out of my comfort zone so heavily that I would have to come face to face with the reality of me as opposed to the dream of me, which was,
Sure.
I had a really strong dream of me that it turned out to be was not totally accurate, but and that was
Can I just want to like offer my observation, which is that growing awareness in you made you so wonderful to work with. I just remember being so calmed by your presence when we were in a big stressful rehearsal and performance process, because I think your perspective was a healthy one. You were there to do the work, you believed in the work, and there's a lot more to the world too.
Yeah, it definitely helped to know. I would always say there's no such thing as a musical theater emergency.
I remember you saying that. Yeah.
Right. Like,
Right.
we would have all these stressful moments, but at the end of the day, we were not curing cancer, even though they would be very stressful situations. But I guess I'm curious about, because I think a lot of people right now in our community are also sort of looking at, okay, what am I going to do temporarily? Or what am I going to do? What am I going to add to being an artist career wise? And I think it's really interesting that you left performing earlier, and I guess I'm wondering a little more about how you came to that decision.
Yeah, I'm wondering that too.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about this. It's a really complicated thing for me. Some of it feels very personal, but I'll just try to be as transparent as possible. And ultimately, I think it was about not having control over my contribution. And it's a crazy thing to say now because no one has any control over any contribution, it feels at times. But I just started to realize that I wasn't doing the work to create balance in my life. Like Mary Mitchell, you talked about it being all consuming, and it really was for me, but all consuming in a way that had a really dark side. It was all consuming in a really galvanizing way when I was working, and then all consuming in a really dark and sort of empty way when I wasn't. And I couldn't figure out how to fill that emptiness in the lifestyle that I was living. And I think that's also connected to how deeply I valued identity of actor. I was so attached to that identity that I wasn't willing to really look at any other identities and invest my time and energies into them. And so ultimately I decided to pursue a career in therapy because I've always been interested in it. But I was telling myself, I think early on, that it wasn't a clean break from acting. It was just like another avenue. And then very quickly, I realized that I got what I needed from it, which was creativity, an ability to contribute on my own schedule and on my own terms. And more than anything, an ability to be influential in people's lives in a really positive way. So I got that from acting, and I certainly get that from this too. And so I'm at a place now where it's just, if I'm really, really honest, I'm not missing anything from the arts career that I don't get now. And I'm also benefiting from having a more private, quieter life that quiets down all the comparisons you do as an artist to other people. It makes you more grateful for the simple things. So I'm just in a better place emotionally, and I'm going to take that with me and keep going in the direction I'm going in.
That's really beautiful. And I think a lot of people right now are really questioning whether they should be pursuing other things. Like I'm sure you must be hearing this from people who are sort of on the brink of, do I really commit to learning something completely different? Do you have any advice for people who are sort of in that position?
Well, I don't want to minimize how hard it is. I mean, I have clients who are just hitting their heads up against the wall trying to find anything. And the market for employment is really rough. And so I feel terrible for the people's circumstances who can't find work. And this might be sort of empty advice or empty comfort, but I still do believe it, which is that artists are incredibly adaptive. I mean, they are trained in ups and downs, in no's and rejection and door slamming, in understanding the vicissitudes of like a really crazy freelance life. And so from a strengths-based perspective, I would just hope that artists listening to this are reminded as to that being one of the superpowers, that adaptation is in their toolbox already.
I love the word superpower so much. I just want to say, and I also want to say, yeah, that has been my biggest, I think, learning of this entire situation is sort of our sort of built-in resilience, because we were always putting so much work into something that, I mean, I just remember like every musical I've ever done, the opening numbers changed like many, many times. And so, and so you put so many hours and hours and hours, and then it's like, okay, it's not working, scrap it, I'll start over and start again tomorrow. And you don't really think, it just feels normal. It's like, oh, right, we're just going to start over tomorrow and do something totally different. And similarly, we go so project based that we would like meet a new group of people and be like, you're the people I'm working with now. There isn't a built-in adaptability that I'm learning does not exist in the corporate world, or in 9 to 5, sort of more 9 to 5 jobs like that.
And what's interesting to me is what's coming out of this is that artists are realizing this about themselves, because it's so normal for you to be rejected on a daily basis. It's so normal for you to empathize with a character. All of these things that are required to be a purposeful human being is what you normally do, but you don't see it because it's in your day-to-day routine. So I find it fascinating that Bobby, your job now is part of your job, not your only job, is to point out to people, hey, you've got this. You already have the skills, not only for survival, but for thriving. So I love that you focus on the strengths-based approach. But this is National Suicide Prevention and Awareness Month. And there are a lot of people who are so stuck, they don't realize their strengths. Can you talk a little bit about suicide, the rising rates, and what's going on, and how people can reach out and what's available?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to think about the two most sort of urgent signs that someone might be suicidal. And one, it's a sense of thwarted belongingness, that they don't belong anywhere. And that's obviously exacerbated by this time. And two, and more to my point, it's a perceived burden on others. And so if someone is hopeless about, first of all, their sense of belonging, and second of all, that they might be a burden on those around them, they're much more likely to have suicidal ideation. And so it makes a lot of sense that this is a time in which suicide is a higher risk for people. What I would say about it is that if anyone watching this is in connection with anyone that they fear is in that place, the most important thing you can do is to communicate them the opposite, which is that they're far from a burden, that you see them, that you are there in support of them, and that you very much want to be there as their support. And so it's scary. I mean, I've had to ask, a couple clients point blank if they had a plan to end their life. And if they had an intent to do so. That said, I think it's important to ask those questions point blank, because what those questions communicate to that person is that they are seen, and that the amplitude of their experience is acknowledged. So as scary as it is to ask those questions, and I understand that people might shy away from those questions because they might fear that it would push someone further into that place. Research shows the opposite is true, that if you ask, bluntly and directly, it can be a lifeline to someone.
That's really helpful information.
It is. I never knew
I don't
that.
think I would have actually, my instinct would be to sort of like go around it a little bit, like circle near it, and not necessarily just be like, hey, are you having these thoughts? Like, is this something that is coming up for you? Like,
I just never thought about the component of feeling like you're a burden. I never would have, you just made that very clear for me to look at people now who who may be depressed and a lens to be concerned. That's important information.
It is.
Yeah.
And well, I was just going to say, I've had two friends during this time frame that have unfortunately not reached out in ways that people could show up for them and made the choice to end their lives. And it's been incredibly traumatic for all of us to really go through that process of, how did I not see it? I wanted to be there.
Well, I don't want to ask a question that's too personal. Did you see it?
No, actually. In both of those cases, no. And maybe I was not close enough.
But to be fair, the people who were close didn't see it anyway, from what you've said.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think it was a pretty heavily shielded despair. And I think it was enhanced by the isolation that people have been feeling without being able to connect with humans in the way that we were used to doing before March.
There's no question. And, human touch is really important. I mean, it's lovely to see your faces. And it's lovely to see the faces of my clients over my computer, but it's just not the same thing. And that's why theater is so important, because we need to be in the same spaces, breathing the same air and telling stories as a collective, So yeah, it's not to be underestimated that the isolation we're experiencing is as big as it is, even if we're connected over the internet.
Right. But I love holding on to the idea of being more proactive and sort of addressing and asking questions that are point blank. I think that's really helpful, actually, for me anyway. That feels really useful.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you have questions for people to ask themselves in times like this? Just to not necessarily about being suicidal, but again, I'm going back to, I need help. This is a problem. This is not something I can get myself out of. Are there questions we should be asking ourselves daily?
Big question. Amidst all the despair, I think it's important to think about the reasons for moving forward and the reasons for hope. Hope and despair can coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. And so the questions I'm constantly asking people are, what's working? What is worth waking up for today? What purpose can you fulfill today, even if it's so tiny? If someone's really depressed, the purpose can be to take a shower. It doesn't have to be to change the world. And if you're overwhelmed by the big picture, sometimes thinking about the small picture is exactly what we need. So yeah, I hope that people will ask questions about how they can use the experience today as an opportunity, as opposed to looking at it only as an obstacle.
Purpose is the thing that I always go to when I'm feeling really, really depressed, is like, I tend to meditate on purpose and sort of how I like helping people. That might not come as a surprise to either of you, but that tends to be a lot of like where I find purpose. And I think that actually, in a weird way, kind of like at least shakes me out of the feelings enough to be able to recognize them as feelings and not as reality, which for me is always really helpful.
Absolutely. And sometimes you just can't think your way out of a state of mind. That's called top down, right? Sometimes you just can't reframe something to make it feel better. So oftentimes you just have to act, you just have to do. And that's a bottom up way of sort of moving through the world. And so, yeah, if you can know something is purposeful and not feel like doing it and override that feeling and just do it, oftentimes on the other side of that action is what you're talking about, which is a little bit of distance from those feelings and an ability to move forward even with them.
So it's like exercise.
Yeah,
like I don't want to do it, but I'm really happy I did it.
It is like exercise, movement.
Okay.
We've talked many times about stress and trauma being stored in the body, and it's not just in the mind. We kind of rationalize it in the mind, but a lot of times it's a physical response, and we have to move the body. We have to do something physically just to circulate it, to get things moving.
Hey, Bobby, I want to go back really quickly to when you made the decision to leave, because you were one of my all-time favorite people to work with, and so gifted, and just a joy to watch on stage as well as to work with behind the scenes. And I'm curious about, so you had to choose to go to school for like a long time, right?
Mhm.
What was that terrifying to sort of leave, like
Well,
for the school part? How did that?
yes and no. I mean, I was trying to get away from some of the more toxic things I was feeling as a result of being in the business. And so some of it felt like relief. And then another part of it was just like an enormous leap of faith. And I guess what I just learned is that my favorite part of acting is the learning process and the gathering of information and figuring out who the character is, and understanding their psychology. And so I guess when I was in classes and realizing I was doing the same thing in just a more academic setting, I didn't feel such a loss. I didn't feel such a crash away from this life that I would never touch again. I think like the meat of it feels similar in some way to me.
That actually really makes sense, because we do spend a lot of time in process, and we do spend a lot of time analyzing the psychology of characters
Absolutely.
in show situations. So I'm completely fascinated on psychology as well. So when I remember you telling the news, and I was like, that's amazing and so exciting. But also it was very unexpected. Do you, I mean, going, because Dr. Keith has written this book on burnout that he's in process. Would you classify the sort of like impetus to leave as a bit of a burnout, or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, only someone in a public facing job can understand it, but being in a public facing job is exhausting at times, because you sort of, for me at least, I have this gap between like how I experienced myself and how I was perceived. And when you're an actor, you're kind of always watching yourself from that third eye, and paying attention to how others perceive of you or write about you or whatever. And that can be really exhausting. So I think I was burned out by that sort of split between private experience and how I felt I was being perceived. And so I just know I needed a simpler, more integrated experience, and that's one that wasn't so public facing.
Yeah, I find your experience and your story fascinating, because in my career, I've worked with a lot of people who have burnt out, but they're caregivers. And I've worked with a lot of therapists who have burnt out, because the mental health community will burn out. But what I've realized with a lot of them is they have this huge artistic life, and many of them dreamt to have the life that you had. That was really their dream, but they settled on being a therapist. I think you may be the first one that I've met that had the life that these people dreamt of and gave it up to become a therapist. So it wasn't really a option two. It was more of, I'm growing upon my life as an actor and performer, and I'm going to use it to become a therapist. Do you work with a lot of performers, but I'm just wondering if you've, in your professional world, have you encountered a lot of people who are kind of self-medicating by helping other people achieve their goals because they really had goals of having the life that you once had? Am I making sense?
You are making sense. I mean, I don't think I can get into the psychological complexities of other therapists. I mean, it makes sense to me that sort of the way you conceive of it makes sense to me. But I don't have any personal experience with someone who might fit that pattern.
And it's not just therapists, but I was interviewing people this weekend who had long careers in the helping professions, and all of them said the one thing that has kept them from burning out is to have some type of art that they rely on, whether it be writing, singing, photography. So, I mean, again, what you were talking about, the arts providing kind of the tools that one can have to negotiate life. It's just so important. So important.
It is. You know, being a therapist is often about absorbing a lot, and being an artist is often about expressing a lot. And that has been a big and interesting change. To not be so focused on what I have to say, but to be more focused on listening and taking something else in. And it's sometimes a challenge. And so I can understand a therapist who's constantly absorbing, having this need to find a place to then externalize and express and show their inner core and their inner expression. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
But what I love about what you just pointed out, Keith, in that sort of question and scenario is the fact that, Bobby, you walked away from something that the world views as like the pinnacle,
right?
You know, and you and I both know that that's not real. That having been in that pinnacle, that it's not, it doesn't feel like a pinnacle when you're in it. And I think it goes back to what I've always kind of called this idea of a holy grail, this idea that that there will ever be a job or a person or a title or a thing, or owning a thing, owning a specific car, or owning like anything external that is going to make you eternally happy. But I feel like we are sort of taught in some ways that if you just keep working hard towards this thing that you want, that when you get it, everything's going to be perfect. And I have to say, for having done a lot of shows and watching people sort of fulfill their dream of being on Broadway, it's fascinating to watch how they cope when they have to like face the reality that that's not true.
Yeah, you point out the fact that there's no such thing as an absolute. I mean, every experience will have its complexities and a whole spectrum from positive to negative. And we live in a culture that is very celebratory of fame and attention and appearance. And so of course we're going to celebrate the idea of being on Broadway as the pinnacle. It's more complicated than that. And so I think anyone's work, no matter where they are, is to acknowledge the complexities of their experience and to invest in the positive and to accept the negative.
Right. But I do think it's a really beautiful thing to acknowledge, like when you achieve the dream that you were coming out and you realize, you get there and you realize, wait, this isn't fulfilling me. To be able to be brave enough to say, this was great, but this is not the thing that I need to fulfill me, and make a big turn like you've done. I find that really inspiring.
It is inspiring. It takes a lot of courage. I
think it does too. And I can't imagine that it was always a straight ahead path either. I mean, it feels like most things, it would be a little curvy in its nature. Like,
yeah. And I think ego is a big part of it. Like to try to separate yourself from the thing that makes you feel valuable is really scary, because the question for me was, well, is there anything else valuable underneath that? So that was a terrifying experiment. And I'm proud that I've found other things to really value in myself, and I feel much more stable as a result. But to take off that thing you relied on for so many years, to define what makes you special, and to throw it away and see what else was there, is really, really scary. I will admit that it was pretty terrifying at times.
And now we're all sort of being forced to do that.
Mm-hmm.
As like a globe in many capacities. Like we're all being forced to do that, which is, we had Vasti Mompoint on last week, and she was talking about having gotten really, really gravely ill and having to stay home and sort of face herself during that time frame. That when the pandemic hit, her first thought was sort of along the lines of like, oh, people have no idea what they're in for when they have to face themselves. And I'm prepared to help them because I just went through this. And it's sort of a thing where, you know, I do think many of us have been really struggling with the, like what you just said, like what is underneath when you strip away all that identity and you separate the ego.
It's funny that we're so hard and afraid. We're so afraid of ourselves because we can be so mean to ourselves. I mean, you think about the again, we go back to rejection, that you have the criticism by living a public life. And then it's still easier than sitting with yourself sometimes. It's still easier than being quiet and facing your own internal demons.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned psychoanalysis earlier, but like the definition of depression, for example, through a psychoanalytic lens, is that it is anger turned towards the self. That it is anger that has come at you, perhaps from a caretaker earlier in your life, that you have internalized and that has turned into your sense of self. So yeah, I think we are our worst critics at the best of times, and so it's incredible to me, to talk to a client who can be so hard on themselves and then accept the same reality in the person next to them. So self-acceptance, self-love, self-forgiveness are huge parts of any therapeutic process, I think.
Yeah, we are much harder on ourselves, I feel, than we are on others. We're much more willing to, I guess, unconditionally love in spite of things with other people, and accept that as like, oh, that's just one of their quirks, or whatever, as than we are with ourselves.
Yeah, and shame is a really, really powerful emotion. I mean, the difference between guilt, which is, oh, I made a mistake, and shame, there's something wrong within me, is a big difference. And a lot of the shame and self-flagellating that people experience is very connected to societal ideas and cultural norms that make people feel bad about breaking those rules or being other in some way. And so that's another whole layer I'm always thinking about when it comes to therapy.
I learned that from my therapist. I went to him one time and I decided that I was going to become a really strict, adamant Buddhist. And there was one of the practices for guilt that you do 108 prostrations and in this 3-hour-long prayer. And I just looked at me and he said, honey, that would be fine if you felt guilt, but you feel shame, and you will never do enough prostrations to get rid of this. You need to go deeper. And I was like, whoa,
Well, did you find that a lot of that shame was prescribed to you as opposed to something that just grew from within?
It grew, both.
Mm-hmm.
Both. I mean, it definitely grew from within by what I thought was supposed to be normal, like familial and societal norms that I did not fit with. So I hid it as a child, and
Sure.
yeah.
And that's a real injustice. That's a real injustice that you had to feel that there was something wrong.
So yeah, but as you said, I mean, we punish ourselves, and punishing ourselves does not get rid of it.
No.
So
plain and simple, no.
So you can send me your bill.
Amazing. Great. Do you have any last thoughts of advice for people as they are navigating the craziness of this time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a writer named Mary Pfeiffer she writes about therapy and mental health, and she uses this term called the transcendence response to trauma. And that's when things become overwhelming, sometimes the only healthy response is to become bigger in some way, to transcend the trauma. And I think it's a helpful way to think about a response to trauma that is helpful, that moves you forward. And it's what people are doing. I mean, you take, the campaigns in the theater world, the We See You campaign, the Dear White American Theater campaign, the Broadway Black Alliance. These are people coming together and becoming bigger in their response to the trauma they've experienced in the theater world. And through that response, there's community, there's purpose, there's meaning, there's change possible, there's forward momentum. And so I just think it's a way to think about trauma that goes beyond the sort of fight or flight response. It can have a little bit more meaning attached to it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
It's
Thank
very
you.
important. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. We have a lightning round of questions to ask you before you exit. Okay.
Jesus, what does that mean?
It means the first thing that comes to mind, you answer.
Okay.
They're not hard
Okay.
or particularly scary, or I don't think trauma inducing, though I guess you can be the judge of that. Okay, the first one is, what is your favorite thing to do for self-care?
Exercise. I force myself to exercise every single day, even if I don't want to, and it puts me in a better mood.
Endorphin. What do you love to do first thing in the morning?
Drink a cup of coffee and to read a book, to not be connected to my internet for a while.
What's your favorite food?
I'm craving like New York Thai delivery all the time.
Oh, me too.
And it has to be delivered. Huh?
Me too.
It has to be delivered. Yeah.
Yes. Beach or mountains?
Mountains.
Yes. Where do you think of as home?
I think of as home these days just being in relationship to my boyfriend, Danny.
Lovely. How do you deal with being angry?
I try to really experience it so that I don't push it down somewhere so that it comes out later in a way I don't plan. And so I feel it, and then I try to feel it privately so that I can understand it, and I feel like I have a better than, I don't know, relationship to it.
What sound do you love?
What sound? Connected to mountains. I love the sound of like a creek or a stream or a river.
Oh man, see, we could
We're all going to Mary Mitchell's house.
Yeah, come to my house. If you were a spice, what spice would you be?
Like multicolored peppercorns.
That feels right. That feels absolutely right. I would multicolored peppercorns also. Thank you so much.
I just bought a bag of those multicolored peppercorns.
Did you?
I did.
I'm impressed. Are you cooking with them?
Always, always. I mean, it's so boring just to stick with white pepper or black pepper. You got to have
That's
the
right.
multicolored pepper.
That's right.
Interesting. I've been into a salt world. I'm in the salt world.
Well, I need to send you
all kinds of different salt. So
people keep giving me all of these different salts. I'm gonna have to
send
mail
them
them to you.
Send them to me. Great. I do want to remind everybody, because I'm going to start doing this hopefully every week, to vote. Please register to vote and use your voice in every way possible. And Dr. Keith, you want to tell us who is
oh yeah, next week we have Yvonne Farrell. Yvonne Farrell is a colleague of mine. She specializes and has written books on using Eastern medicine and Eastern philosophy for trauma. So she is going to be talking about specific exercises you can do that comes from a Chinese medicine point of view to transform trauma in your life, even if it's intergenerational trauma. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation.
Excellent. So everybody have a really good week.
Yeah, thank you, artists striving to end poverty. Bye, everybody. Be well. Thank you, Bobby.
Bye.
Thank you.